on?
Well, this week we are concentrating on evaluating arguments, deciding whether arguments are sound, deciding whether arguments are good. This will be the last week that we'll be working with these sort of specimen arguments. They call them specimen arguments because they're rather artificial. They're arguments, mostly arguments that I just made up off the top of my head. For examples, here and there, I probably clipped one from another philosophy teacher somewhere, but they're all basically just sort of arguments that are there to be analyzed. Next week, when we begin looking at New York Times editorials, those are real world arguments. I think in a video that I've linked to, another philosophy teacher calls them arguments in the wild. Arguments that you actually meet with in newspapers, magazines, books. He actually analyzes a YouTube video argument. But we're working on our skills here, and the skills are ongoing. The first skill I mean is the analyzing an argument, laying bare its logical structure, as I've been saying, which just basically means deciding where the reasoning is and sort of become very clear on it. And, using maybe standard form as a way of making the argument more clear, deciding what its premises are, what its main conclusion is, what the intermediate conclusions are, looking for those chunks of reasoning that I was trying to make explicit in the last video last week. And that's what we're doing this week. We're looking at some simple arguments, asking whether they're good arguments, whether they're sound arguments, which basically means what? Whether their premises are true, or at least likely to be true, and whether the conclusion actually follows from the premises. Now, we know that in deductive arguments, for an argument to be called sound, the conclusion must follow with absolute certainty from the premises. That's, a deductive argument, but most arguments that we meet with don't present themselves in deductive form. So when we're asking about an inductive argument, for instance, like this argument here, we're not asking whether or not the conclusion follows with absolute certainty, in the sense that if the premises are true, that the conclusion also has to be true. We're asking really whether in our judgment, whether the conclusion is well supported by the premises, whether the premises give us good reason to think that the conclusion is true. It's an art, not a science. There's no absolute sort of strict infallible rule that we can apply to determine whether the conclusion is well supported by the premises. It's something that we have to use our judgment for. Now, again, the process of actually outlining arguments, or analyzing arguments down to their basics of premises and conclusions, that's ongoing. And when we come to an argument like this, which is another specimen argument, we have to do that work first, and then we're in a position to evaluate the strength of the argument, its soundness. So that is an ongoing thing. First, we'll look at this argument to determine what its logical structure is, what its reasoning actually is. And then we'll, look and see whether we think it's a good argument, meaning whether we think its premises are plausible, whether they're true or at least likely to be true, and whether the conclusion actually follows from those premises.